It was supposed to be just another boring Sunday. I was lying on the living room floor, half watching some cooking show I didn't care about, and half repairing the ancient remote that kept dropping the volume by itself. Melissa, my wife, was out grabbing groceries, which somehow turned into a 3-hour tour every weekend now, and the kids were at her sister's for the night. The house was quiet for once. While trying to fish out a spare battery that had rolled under the couch, I spotted something shiny between the dust balls and crumbs, something that had no business being there. I reached in, stretched my arm all the way, and when I pulled it out, my stomach dropped. It was a single dangling earring, silver with a tiny blue stone, something delicate, expensive-looking, and unfamiliar. Not Melissa's style at all. I should know. I bought her every piece of jewelry she owned. This one was new. This one wasn't hers. For a moment, I just stared at it, my hand hovering like I was holding a live grenade. It didn't make sense. Melissa hadn't had anyone over, not that I knew of. We hadn't hosted anything in weeks. The only guests we'd had lately were family. My brain immediately tried to rationalize it. Maybe it belonged to her sister, maybe to one of her friends, maybe she bought it and dropped it, maybe I was overthinking. But something about the way it shimmered in the light, like it was mocking me, made it hard to let go. I stood up, walked over to the hallway mirror, and just stared at myself, holding that tiny thing between my fingers like it could whisper the truth if I waited long enough. When Melissa came back an hour later, holding 2 plastic bags and sipping on some overpriced smoothie, I was already in the kitchen pretending to do the dishes. I didn't say anything. I didn't show her the earring. I just watched her. She was chirpy, too chirpy, like she had just come from a comedy show instead of the grocery store. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and started unloading the bags. Avocados, fancy crackers, 3 bottles of wine, strange mix for someone who was just getting dinner stuff. I kept washing dishes that weren't dirty just so I wouldn't have to speak. I was scared my voice would shake. Later that night, while she was in the shower, I went back to the couch and looked deeper. I moved every cushion, checked underneath, between the wooden frame, under the rug. And there it was again this time, a crumpled receipt wedged beneath the leg of the couch. From a florist. 2 days ago. A bouquet of midnight roses and a handwritten note that just said, "You looked stunning last night. Same time next week." My ears rang. I sat back down, this time not bothering to pretend it was anything else. I was being played. When Melissa came out wrapped in a towel, humming some pop tune she didn't even like, she looked at me sitting there and asked why I looked like someone had died. I almost laughed. "No one's dead. Just had a weird headache," I said, forcing a smile. She shrugged and walked past me, her bare feet tapping down the hall. I noticed she hadn't even asked what I'd been doing all day. Didn't care. Maybe never did. I slept on the couch that night. She didn't ask why. I woke up to the sound of a door closing. Not slamming, just that quiet, careful sound people make when they don't want to wake anyone. I glanced at the clock, 6:12 a.m. Melissa was already gone. That wasn't normal. Her shift didn't start until 9, and even when she had early meetings, she'd leave after 7. I sat up slowly on the couch, feeling the stiffness in my back and something heavier than pain pressing into my chest. I didn't know where she went, but I knew it wasn't to work. And I knew I wasn't crazy anymore. I didn't follow her. I stayed home, sat in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and the earring on the table in front of me. I just stared at it for maybe an hour, like it could answer the question burning in my head. I didn't want to play detective. I didn't want to dig through her things, follow her around town, or start some pathetic game of catching her in the act. But it wasn't about wanting anymore. It was about needing to know how much of my life had become a joke behind my back. She came back just before 8. Same smoothie cup in her hand, same calm, normal tone when she walked in and said, "Morning. You're up early." I didn't answer. She put her keys down, kicked off her shoes, and opened the fridge like it was any other day. That was the moment I saw it clearly. She wasn't scared. She wasn't nervous. She'd already made peace with whatever line she crossed. She didn't expect to get caught, and she didn't think I'd ever call her on it. Later that day, while she was at work for real this time, I searched the house, not because I was hoping to find more proof, but because I already knew the truth and wanted to see just how long she'd been hiding it. Her laptop was locked, her phone was fingerprint secured, but her desk drawer in the office, the one she barely used, wasn't locked. Inside were printed directions to a hiking trail an hour outside of town, 2 movie tickets to a film we never saw together, and a restaurant receipt for 2 from a place she always said was too expensive for us. There were no names, no photos, just small, casual pieces of her life that didn't include me. I put everything back exactly the way I found it and sat down in the office chair, not knowing if I felt more angry or just stupid. That night, I didn't sleep on the couch. I went back to our bed and laid next to her like everything was fine. She reached for my hand under the blanket. I let her hold it. It felt like I was borrowing someone else's life for a moment, someone who still trusted their wife, who still thought everything was real. The next morning, I told her I had to run a few errands and left just after sunrise. I didn't actually have anywhere to go. I parked 2 blocks away and waited. At 8:17, she left again. Same smoothie, same quick look over her shoulder as she stepped outside. I followed this time. Not right behind, just enough to keep her in view. She didn't go to the hospital. She drove past it and headed west, into the old part of town where the buildings still had peeling paint and most stores were family-run. I watched from the corner as she parked, got out, and walked into a small cafe I'd never seen before. She wasn't alone. A man in a gray hoodie was already inside, sitting by the window, waiting. She leaned in to hug him. It wasn't casual. It wasn't innocent. His hand stayed on her waist longer than necessary. She sat down across from him, and they talked like they'd done this before, like this was normal for them. I stayed outside. I didn't need to see more. I didn't need to hear their conversation. I already knew what it meant. I drove home, parked, went back inside, and stood in our kitchen. Her smoothie cup from that morning was still in the sink. I stared at it for a long time before tossing it in the trash. That evening, she came home and kissed me on the cheek. I kissed her back. I even asked how her day went. She lied without blinking. Something about a patient who wouldn't stop complaining, paperwork delays, a coworker being annoying again. I nodded like I believed her. She laughed at some stories she told, and I forced myself to smile. I watched her pour a glass of wine, sit on the couch, and flip through her phone. The earring was still in my pocket. I rubbed it between my fingers like a coin I was deciding whether to spend or save. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. Not without a plan. But I wasn't going to sit around and wait for the next lie either. I didn't need a private investigator or a hidden camera to know what was going on. The man she met at the cafe was younger than me, probably in his early 30s, clean-cut, athletic build, the type of guy who posts gym selfies and thinks they count as personality. I didn't care about who he was. I cared about the fact that she looked at him in a way I hadn't seen in years. And not just with affection, but with comfort. Like someone she trusted more than her own husband. That stung more than any kiss or hotel receipt ever could. It meant whatever they had, it wasn't just physical. It meant she gave him parts of herself that used to belong to me. I didn't confront her that week. Instead, I mirrored her schedule. I left early. I stayed out late. I changed routines. I wanted to see how long it would take before she noticed that something in me had shifted. She didn't. Or maybe she did and didn't care. Either way, the silence between us wasn't new. It was just heavier now. I stopped asking questions I didn't want fake answers to. She stopped pretending to be the woman I married. We became polite strangers under the same roof, playing house for no one but ourselves. By the 4th day of my little experiment, I decided it was time to see how far she was willing to go. I called in sick at work, something I hadn't done in almost a year, and waited for her to leave. Once she was gone, I followed again, keeping a safer distance this time. She didn't go to the cafe. She went to a small apartment complex 20 minutes away, one of those newer places with the modern steel balconies and coated entry paths. She parked, got out, and didn't even glance around. She walked up like she belonged there, like she'd done it a dozen times before. He opened the door before she knocked. That told me everything. She wasn't just visiting. She had a standing invite. I didn't stay to see her come out. I didn't need to. I went home, sat at the dining table, and stared at nothing. I was calm, which was strange. I thought I'd be angry, but instead I felt something worse. I felt nothing. Like I had already grieved the loss of our marriage without knowing it. I reached for my phone and opened my notes app. I started writing not a confession, not a letter to her, but a list. A list of everything I had done for her over the years. Every time I put her first. Every sacrifice I made so she could feel supported. Every plan I adjusted because she changed her mind. I wrote it all down, not to guilt her, but to remind myself that I wasn't the one who gave up. That I wasn't crazy for thinking we were still worth something. When she came home that night, she brought takeout. Plopped the bag on the counter like it was some kind of peace offering and said, "Figured you'd be too tired to cook." I thanked her. We ate in silence, watching something forgettable on TV. She laughed at the show a few times. I nodded and pretended to care. When it was over, She started cleaning up and asked if I wanted tea. I said sure, even though I didn't. As she boiled the water, I watched her back and tried to remember when I stopped recognizing her. It wasn't about a single moment. It was a slow fade. She turned around and caught me staring. "What?" she asked, smiling like she used to. I smiled back. "I've been thinking about a trip," I said casually. "Maybe a week off. Somewhere quiet." She looked interested but cautious. "You mean for both of us?" "No, just me. I think I need some space to clear my head." She hesitated. "Is something wrong?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe I just need a break from everything. Work, the house, routine. I feel stuck." She bit her lip, nodded slowly, and said, "If that's what you need." She didn't fight it. She didn't ask to come. She didn't suggest therapy or question my motives. That told me she was already checked out. She probably thought I was gearing up to ask for a separation, or maybe she was hoping I would so she didn't have to. Either way, she didn't push back. That made my decision even easier. I booked a room 2 hours away in a quiet town near the mountains. I told her I'd leave Friday afternoon and be back Sunday. She said she'd probably visit her sister that weekend. Perfect. That gave me time to move forward with my plan. Friday came faster than I expected. I packed my bag that morning, not because I needed much for the weekend, but because I wanted everything to look normal. Melissa was already gone by the time I finished my coffee. I sat at the table, staring at her empty mug next to mine, the same spot she left it every morning. I left it there, untouched. I didn't bother cleaning anything up. I wanted her to see what I saw when she got back, a home that had paused the moment I walked out. I didn't drive to the mountains. I didn't even leave town. Instead, I parked at a friend's place who owed me a favor and spent the day setting up the house for what I had planned. I went through the drawers and cabinets and took photos of everything she had left behind, everything she clearly hadn't thought twice about. I went through our shared files, found her insurance documents, her car lease, her work schedule from last year saved in a random folder, and printed it all out. I wasn't planning to hurt her physically. I wasn't going to scream or break anything, but I was going to make sure she felt what I felt, the full weight of being deceived. By late afternoon, I had everything packed into a single manila envelope. The earring, the florist receipt, a copy of the movie tickets, photos of the apartment complex with her walking in. It wasn't about proof anymore. It was about presentation. She lied with ease, so I had to show her that I had known for a long time, that I had stayed quiet not because I was clueless, but because I was choosing my moment. At 7:42 p.m., I walked back into the house. She wasn't there yet. I turned off all the lights except for the hallway one and left the envelope in the middle of the kitchen table. Then I sat in the living room, lights off, waiting. She came in 20 minutes later, humming something under her breath as she opened the door. She tossed her keys into the bowl near the front door and walked straight into the kitchen. I didn't move. I just listened. After a few seconds of silence, she called out, "Eric." Her voice was different, lighter, like she was in a good mood. "You back early?" I didn't answer. A beat passed. Then I heard her pull the chair out, the sound of the envelope sliding across the table. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen. She looked up as I entered, the opened envelope in front of her, the contents spread out. Her eyes locked on mine, and for the first time in months, she didn't say anything. I sat down across from her. No one spoke for a while. "You've been busy," she finally said. "I wanted to be sure," I replied. She looked down at the pictures, the earring, the paper trail she hadn't realized she left. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even shocked. She was just still. Then she picked up the receipt, looked at it for a few seconds, and said, "So now what?" I leaned forward. "Now I want you to say it out loud." She paused. "Say what?" "Tell me what you did." She swallowed hard. "Eric, I didn't mean." "No, you don't get to start with what you didn't mean. You went to his apartment. You kissed him in public. You lied about working late, about seeing your sister, about going shopping. You told him things you stopped saying to me. You made a choice. So now say it." Her eyes narrowed, and something changed in her face. "Fine. I cheated. I've been seeing him for a few months. I wasn't looking for anything. It just happened. I didn't plan it. It wasn't about you." I leaned back in my chair. "You didn't plan it, but you found the time for it. You planned it enough to hide it." "He made me feel like someone again," she said, her voice sharper now. "Like I wasn't just a wife, or a nurse, or a person who had to ask permission to want something different." "You never had to ask permission," I said. "You just had to be honest. But you chose secrets instead." You chose him instead of telling me what was wrong. She shook her head. You wouldn't have understood. No, I probably wouldn't have. But I would have respected the truth. The silence between us grew heavier, and neither of us touched the papers on the table anymore. It was all out now, and there was no going back. She tried to speak again, but I stood up before she could. I'm not here to argue, I said. I'm here to tell you what's next. She looked up. You're leaving. I nodded. I already have. I just came back for this. I walked past her, not waiting for a response, and went to the bedroom to grab the bag I had packed that morning. She followed me, standing in the doorway as I zipped it closed. Are you really done? She asked, quieter now. I stopped. You were done first. You just didn't tell me. I didn't sleep that night, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to. I sat in the guest room of a friend's condo, staring at the ceiling while the city moved quietly outside the window. The confrontation had gone exactly how I expected, which is to say it was underwhelming, controlled, even polite in a way that made it worse. She didn't scream or beg. She didn't cry. She admitted what she did, and then stood there as I walked out with my bag. There was no drama, just two people who had stopped trying long before they ever admitted it. The moment I closed that door, everything that had once made up my life felt distant, like I was now observing it from the outside. I had no plan beyond that night. I hadn't contacted a lawyer yet, hadn't figured out what to do about the house, the accounts, the split. But I knew I wasn't going back. That much was settled. The next morning, I didn't check my phone until afternoon. 10 missed calls. All from her. 2 texts, both short. The first one said, "Can we talk before you do something stupid?" The second one just said, "Please." I deleted them without responding. There was nothing else to say. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about how this would unravel, about what I would tell people, about how it would affect her image, her routine, her comfort. For her, the affair was probably a detour, not a destination. But for me, it was a wall, one that I had no interest in climbing back over. That afternoon, I met with a divorce attorney. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. I sat across from a woman in her early 40s who had seen this kind of story 100 times and didn't need me to explain the details. I gave her the basics, handed over the printed copies of everything I had, and told her I didn't want a drawn-out fight. I wanted out. She nodded like she'd heard the same line the day before, maybe even twice that morning. Are you hoping for full separation of assets? She asked, tapping her pen against a blank form. I want what's fair, I said. I just want my share. No more, no less. She looked at the photos, skimmed the receipts, and paused when she reached the apartment complex picture. This will help. I'm not trying to bury her, I said. I just want to be done. She nodded again, more slowly this time. Then we'll file clean. You'll need to have a final conversation. Something clear, preferably on record. I knew that was coming. I didn't want to do it, but I had to. It wasn't about closure or emotional honesty. It was about logistics. About drawing a line that neither of us could pretend wasn't there. I texted Melissa later that day and told her to meet me at the house the next evening. She replied almost immediately. Okay. I arrived first. The house looked exactly as I left it. Her car wasn't there yet. I unlocked the door and walked in, the same way I had 1,000 times before, only this time it felt like I was trespassing. I didn't sit down. I just stood in the living room, waiting. She arrived 15 minutes later, wearing jeans and a plain black shirt, her hair pulled back, no makeup. She looked tired. Or maybe she just looked like someone who had spent the last day rehearsing what to say. Hi, she said, closing the door behind her. Let's just get through this, I answered. We both sat at the dining table. I pulled out my phone and set it to record. I'm recording this, I said. She nodded. I figured. I looked at her for a second before speaking. You admitted to the affair. I have records. You know I'm filing for divorce. I know. I'm not going to fight for more than what's fair. I don't want to ruin your life. But I'm not covering for you either. I'm not asking you to. I just want it said out loud, clearly. No games. She folded her hands and stared at the table. I had an affair. It wasn't just once. I lied to you. I know I broke something we can't fix. Good, I said. That's all I needed to hear. There was a pause. Then she looked up at me. Do you hate me? I took a breath. No. That's the problem. I don't hate you. I don't even want revenge. I just want this over. She blinked quickly, like she wanted to say something else but didn't have the words. I stood up and stopped the recording. I'll let the attorney know you've acknowledged everything. You'll get the papers next week. She stood too. Can we talk again after this? I don't think so. She nodded slowly. Okay. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out, got in my car, and drove away. I didn't cry when the divorce papers were signed. I didn't feel proud either. It was a strange kind of flatness, like finishing a long, complicated project you never wanted to start. The process itself was clean. She didn't contest anything. She didn't try to keep the house, didn't push back on the accounts or argue over who got what. The lawyer said it was one of the quietest divorces she'd handled all year. I guess that's what happens when both people are too tired to fight. We split everything right down the middle, just like I said. I took my car, half the savings, and the storage unit I had already started filling with the things I knew I'd want. She kept the house. I didn't even flinch when I signed it over. It wasn't my home anymore, and I had no interest in pretending it was. For a few weeks, I stayed with my buddy Dean. He offered me the spare room without asking questions. We didn't talk about the divorce. We watched basketball, made late-night grocery runs, and kept the TV volume up too high. It wasn't therapy, but it was enough. On the day the final papers were filed and everything was legally over, I didn't tell anyone. I took the train into the city, walked around without a destination, sat in a cafe I'd never been to, and just watched people. Couples laughed, kids ran around, old men argued about politics. Life didn't stop just because mine had changed. Eventually, I found a small apartment on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just one bedroom and enough space for what I had left. It was quiet, which I liked. No shared walls, no sounds of another person's life bleeding into mine. I bought furniture in silence, unpacked my boxes in silence, and cooked dinner in silence. That silence didn't bother me. It was the most honest part of my day. I didn't miss being married. I missed who I thought I was when I was married. There's a difference. I missed the idea of coming home to someone who cared, the kind of comfort you assume is real until you're proven wrong. One night, maybe 3 weeks after I moved in, Melissa called. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. Just to talk. Just once. I listened to her voice twice before deleting it. Not because I was angry, but because I had nothing left to say. I wasn't interested in dissecting the past. I didn't need to understand your choices anymore. They were hers to live with now. I had my own work to do, rebuilding from the ground up, figuring out what came next. There was no room in that process for coffee with someone who used to lie to my face and sleep in my bed. My family took it harder than I did. My sister kept asking if I needed anything. My mom wanted to know if Melissa had begged for forgiveness. I didn't give them details. I just said we'd grown apart. People always need a reason that makes them feel better. I wasn't going to be the one to break down what betrayal looks like behind closed doors. That was between Melissa and me, and now it was over. About a month later, I ran into her by accident at the grocery store. We almost didn't notice each other. She looked thinner, more pale, like she hadn't been sleeping well. She saw me first and gave a small wave. I nodded back. We didn't speak. Just passed each other in the cereal aisle. That moment confirmed what I already knew. There was no going back, no hidden corner of us that still had life in it. We were just two people who used to know everything about each other and now knew nothing that mattered. Looking back, the hardest part wasn't losing her. It was realizing that I had already lost her long before I admitted it. The affair was just the final form of something that had been dying in silence. I'd been alone for longer than I knew, and now I wasn't anymore. That was the truth of it. Not a tragic ending, not a dramatic collapse. Just two people who stopped choosing each other and didn't notice until it was too late. I'm not angry now. I'm not bitter. I'm not out looking for revenge or some kind of dramatic rebound. I go to work. I come home. I read a little before bed. It's not exciting, but it's real. And that's enough for me, at least for now. Maybe one day I'll meet someone new. Maybe not. But if I do, it'll be because I'm ready, not because I'm trying to fill the space Melissa left behind. That space is gone now. I cleared it out myself. Some things don't need a big ending. Sometimes the final moment is just a quiet decision in a small apartment on a regular afternoon. To move forward, to stop looking back, and to finally let go.